Hello whisky fans, guess what? I've bought another weird whisky, a weird experimental whisky. The kind of thing that gets me excited, so get comfy if you're up for a rather long and rambling video. This is Loch Lomond Distillery Edition number 3. So this is the third release in the Loch Lomond Distillery Edition series, and it looks a lot like Loch Lomonds tend to look these days. Give you a quick look at the label. I like it. I think it's a really nice bottle, really nice label, really clean and modern. You have a look at the back label there. No QR code, sadly. Would be nice if everyone did that, but that's what we've got. So being the Loch Lomond Distillery Edition series doesn't actually mean, as I expected it to, that you have to go to the distillery in person. You don't have to do that to get hold of one of these, because you can actually buy these on the distillery website as well. That's good enough. And I'm pleased to say, especially since there are only 500 bottles of this ever made, that it's still in stock as of today. The previous two expressions in the Distillery Edition series from Loch Lomond, we had a single blend. So because Loch Lomond Distillery make their own malt whisky and their own grain whisky and a few oddballs in between, Loch Lomond is one of the few distilleries that are able to make a single blend with all of the malt and the grain whiskies coming from the same distillery. And the other one in the Loch Lomond Distilleries Edition series was an experiment with Chardonnay yeast. This one that we've got here, this is actually another very experimental whisky. It's a whisky which was produced with a 3-week long fermentation. So a lot of you all know that a standard fermentation for a whisky, or what goes into the stills to become whisky, might be around 3 days. So this is kind of similar to what Ardbeg did with their Fermentation release. Although I'm pleased to say that with Ardbeg Fermentation, because it's Ardbeg and because they can get away with it, or at least they are for now, they were charging £115 for that Ardbeg, which was 13 years old and made with that long fermentation period. This stuff is 10 years old, so it's a little bit younger, but it is a lot higher strength, because I think the fermentation was something daft like 52%. This is Cask Strength from Loch Lomond, and it comes in at 57.2. And the main thing is that this stuff sells for £70 a bottle. So perhaps a little bit expensive for a 10-year-old whisky, but when you consider the presentation and that it's cask strength and that it's such small batch, I don't think that's too bad. As for the fact that there's only 500 bottles of this, one of the things that I always like to ask when I see something like that is how many casks have gone into that. So 500 bottles is going to give you, it's going to be a batch of about 350 litres, so that's more than a hogshead. And we have been told that this is matured in refill bourbon, so it's probably going to be a batch of about 2 ASB casks, 2 American standard barrels. I do find it a little bit strange that they haven't given us cask numbers on this. Not that it really matters, but people like us, we like that kind of thing, don't we? We like that little detail. But doesn't really matter. What does matter is that there's no mention on the label or the tube that I can see of natural colour, or the fact that this is non-chill filtered, which really, really irritates me. No mention of that anywhere, except that there is on the website. So, like Laphroaig, Loch Lomond, it seems, are one of those annoying companies that sometimes gives us a craft presentation, sometimes they don't, sometimes they tell us, and sometimes they don't. So it's really great that they've given us a full natural colour, non-chill filtered presentation on this one, which you can see there. A little bit of haze, even at room temperature at cask strength. Still a little bit of haze there. And we know that that's natural colour for 10 years in refill bourbon. Really great that they've done that. But personally, when I'm looking to buy a special bottle of whisky, I must say that I do find it easier to buy the one that has all of the guarantees of presentation on the label, rather than having to wonder and guess and pull my phone out in the shop and hope that I've got connection and go on Google and go on the website and start searching. It's easier to buy the one that's just got the guarantees on the label so we know what we're getting. Just saying. What they do tell us about this whiskey though is that it was distilled in 2012 and it was bottled in 2023, which is 10 years if they distilled it late in the year. And obviously, as I said before, it was fermented for 3 weeks, which works out as around 500 hours, which is probably approaching 10 times longer than what you get on the average, or 10 times longer than what a lot of distilleries are getting away with these days. We also know this was distilled in the straight neck stills at Loch Lomond, and it was distilled to a low collection strength. Whether that low collection strength means a low first cut point or a low second cut point, or both, we don't know. But it's interesting that they've made another decision with this one, which has voted in the favour of a reduced yield and a reduced efficiency, hopefully in the interests of looking for better quality. So basically the exact opposite of what most distilleries are doing today. So the questions that I had for this one when I first got it, I've had this one for just over a week, I think. The questions that I was asking when I first tried it are going to be, how does this compare to Ardbeg Fermentation? Are there similarities with the Ardbeg? Are there differences from the Ardbeg? How does it compare with the other standard core releases from the Loch Lomond range? What differences can we smell and taste? And is it worth the extra cost? So let's get some in the glass and find out. I have tried this both, well, I've consumed most of this at Cask Strength. I have also tried it with water at various strengths. To be honest, I haven't tried it too low ABV, but in my opinion this works really, really well at full cask strength or with water. You all know that this is going to be a real fruit bomb. That's the whole point of a long fermentation, to bring out those really fruity, estery, clean, fruity, sort of good new make notes. And I do think that if you add some water to this, you lose some things, you gain others. It changes, but it's still a very, very good whiskey at a slightly reduced strength, and it does accentuate some of those fruity notes. So Loch Lomond 10-year-old Distillery Edition number 3, the 3-week fermented one on the nose. Beautifully creamy and fruity on the nose. Really nice tinned peaches note. Nectarines. Beautiful crisp pear note. Some really nice, slightly creamy, sugary sweet lemon notes. A little bit of a melon note on the nose as well. Melon and green grapes. Quite appley. I'd say that the core flavour of this, perhaps on the nose and possibly the palate as well, is possibly like a soft green apple note. Especially when you add some water to this, the appley notes really come out. Quite spirity, but not in a harsh, immature way. Spirity as in kind of like some fermenting fruit notes, like the fruitiness that you get from a really good new make. Also something musty on the nose of this one. I think it's got, considering that it's such a fruit bomb, it has got some really good complexity and depth to it as well. A little bit of a musty apple peel note perhaps. Musty and creamy. A little bit of a mushroom pate note. Lemon fondant on the nose. Lemon sherbet. Lemon zest. And not too upfront and prominent, but a really nice sweet caramel note. So I must say that this Loch Lomond is kind of exactly my kind of whiskey. I really like whiskies with a real extreme fruitiness, and I really like whiskies that are quite sharp. I really like bourbon maturations, and I also really like refill whiskies. I feel like it's not popular these days to say that you like refill. Refill is kind of seen as the enemy. And I think that's partly because so many companies have spent so long telling us that casks are the key to flavour, casks are the key to whiskey. Buy our whiskey, because we used Somalian apple brandy casks that are hand assembled by a skilled tradesman's feet. Everything is always about some weird exotic wood, some weird cask. And I think that we're concentrating a little bit too much on first fill and a little bit too much on the flavours that you get from a cask. Whereas if you get not dead inactive wood, but if you get a good refill cask that really takes a back seat and allows the spirit to develop and mature and show you the flavours that it actually has within itself rather than covering them up, I think that can give you something really special. So yeah, exactly my kind of thing. Let's see how it tastes. That is so good. Can I just end the review there? Can I just have that as my verdict? More lovely fizzy lemon sweets, some really nice like sweet melon notes, a little bit of a slightly spirity, in a good way again, sort of pear drops note, some sweet orangey notes coming out on the palate that I didn't really get that much of on the nose, so like sweet satsumas, as well as something that I quite often get with a lot of Loch Lomond's, a slightly butteriness which adds some really nice depth and flavour contrast. I would say though, probably less of that creamy butteriness in this one than you get on things like the Loch Lomond 10 and the 12. Quite a slightly sour maltiness on the palate of this whiskey, as well as some grapefruit notes, some more of those green apples. In particular on the late palate, some really nice tart apples and apple peel notes mixing in really well with the slightly bitter oak. Let's have another little sip and look at the finish. Fantastic. Lovely, grippy, tart, slightly astringent, very sweet and sharp, but also perfectly balanced. This is really... It would make a really good desert island dram. If you had to drink this and this alone for the rest of your life, I would be pretty happy with that. As for the finish, long and lingering with lots of lemon, maltiness and oak. Some really gorgeous grapefruit astringency underpinned by that really good ABV. I really like that. With this one, look, you could say that Loch Lomond have gone a little bit premium with this one, charging £70 for a 10-year-old whiskey. But when it's this good, and I'm assuming that it's probably a vatting of 2 casks, so it's really limited edition, and I think that you get the singularity of those flavours coming through from those 2 casks. You can tell that this isn't a mass-produced, muddied, over-blended vatting. And in particular, that 57.2% ABV and how well made this is, it's so drinkable and so intensely flavourful that I really love this stuff, and I think it is worth £70. I mentioned before that I have tried this with a little bit of water, just 2 or 3 drops, and I think that knocking the ABV down that little bit, it doesn't need it. I think that once you get a bit of air to this, it's completely drinkable at cask strength, and a wonderful experience to do so. But you add a little bit of water, and I think that it really brings out that green apple note. I think it probably also adds a little bit of a sweet, nutty bourbon cask note, and also accentuates a little bit of that pleasant oakiness and a slight farminess. Anyone that's used to the Loch Lomond 12-year-old, if you go to this, you might be a little bit disappointed, because I think this is an unpeated whiskey. I'm not getting any peat in this at all. I think it says so somewhere. Yeah, on the bottom of the front label. Unpeated, straight neck still, low collection strength. So there's no peat in this. Very slight, sort of musty, very, very faint, smoky farminess. But it's not a peated whiskey. So definitely don't expect that for any fans of the 12-year-old. But I think the fact that they've gone with unpeated on this, and they've gone with refill bourbon casks on this, is a really, really smart move. I think that if you'd gone with fresh bourbon and peat on this, you wouldn't have highlighted the wonderful fruity estery notes on this that you do get, which again I think is evidence that Loch Lomond are a distillery that's rightfully gaining a very loyal following, because they really know what they're doing and they're making some great whiskey at a fair price. When I was first doing my tasting notes for this, the day that I got it, I was in a little bit of a hurry. I didn't have a lot of time. It was quite late. And I poured probably about that much in my glass. And I had most of it left when I went to bed. And I kind of didn't have time to go back to it the next day. So I actually got around to finishing that glass after 2 days of being in a mostly uncovered glass. And it actually fared really well. I think that this whiskey, it's got that fruity intensity and the viscosity from that quality presentation and the high ABV, which means that it doesn't fall apart instantly like most whiskies do, because it is that well made. So it's good stuff. It's really, really good stuff. But the question is, what do we make of the gimmick on this one? Because it is, we have to admit, it's a whiskey with a gimmick. They've tried something experimental, and they've given us some details, the carrot on the stick, to make us enthusiasts try this stuff. So what's the verdict? I think it's worked really, really well. I think that you can tell that there's been a clear influence on this whiskey that you don't get with the other Loch Lomonds. It's got that fruit bomb profile, and it shows you there's such an amazing untapped reservoir of quality to be had from any distillery that decides to go down this long fermentation route. And it really reminds me of, if there's any homebrewers out there, and I'm sure there's a few, the kind of instructions that you get on a cheap liquid malt extract homebrew kit, you know, the ones where you've got everything. Sometimes you have to add your own refined sugar, but like your starter homebrew kits. And if you look at the instructions on them, they quite often say, like, can be ready to drink within like 5 days or something absurd like that. And you can take a cheap homebrew kit and you can have something that is drinkable within 4 or 5 days if you want crap beer. But if you want good beer, any experienced brewers will tell you that you really need to leave it for at least a few weeks, perhaps even several months. Yeast doesn't just convert sugars to alcohol. It cleans up all of those impurities, and it does a lot more rather than just making ABV. And given enough time, the yeast, after it's converted all those easily accessible sugars, it will move on to other things, and eventually it will give you that beautifully estery fruit bomb profile. One thing that I did find a little bit odd when I was reading through the marketing blurb on the Loch Lomond website about this stuff is that they mention that the long fermentation allows a second bacterial fermentation. And obviously, as I've said, I really like Loch Lomond, and I have done for a long time, and they know what they're doing and they're very good at their jobs, but I'm not quite sure that mention of the long fermentation time giving a chance for a second bacterial fermentation is quite true, or rather that I think that it's a bit of an oversimplification. If you have bacteria in your washbacks, and you will if they're wooden washbacks, then any bacteria that you've got in there is going to really go to work on your sugary liquor as soon as you put it into that washback, whether it's a 3-week fermentation or a 3-hour fermentation. The second that you fill your washbacks, you've essentially got a pure source of unlimited sugar, which is going to give anything in that washback, whether it's bacteria or yeast, a very, very easy time. Which is why brewers and home brewers always take great care that when you pitch your yeast into your wort, you do it as soon as possible after mashing and at the right temperature so that yeast gets going as soon as possible. Technically, at the end of your 3-week fermentation, which is when Loch Lomond are saying you get that second bacterial fermentation, is actually when you're least vulnerable to a bacterial infection. Because by then the yeast has already produced enough alcohol to kill off its competition. As the yeast eats the sugar and produces alcohol, it actually produces the alcohol to sterilize its environment and kill off its competition. That is how yeast has evolved. It's what yeast does, and it's yeast's great key to survival. Yes, you'll probably get bacteria having an input on the flavours late in the process, but the yeast also isn't completely dead and inactive after 2 or 3 weeks. I think it's doing a little bit of a disservice to the yeast, because the yeast is still largely responsible for that wonderful, clean, estery flavour profile that we have here. Again, I don't think that what Loch Lomond have said on their website is wrong, but I do think that it's a little bit of an oversimplification. Without a doubt, though, that long fermentation time is absolutely king. I'd argue that it's probably always a good thing to ferment longer, at least much longer than distilleries normally do. I think, in my opinion at least, I think that we saw it do wonderful things in Ardbeg fermentation, and I think that it's done equally wonderful things here in this Loch Lomond. People are always talking about the difference between whisky now and whisky in bygone days, and how there's lots of things wrong with modern whisky. So overly hot stills, a rush production, high yield barley, as opposed to looking for flavour, high yield yeasts, poor casks, short maturations. And all of those people are absolutely right, but I think that rush production and short fermentation times are probably one of the big reasons why a lot of modern whisky can seem like it has a little bit less magic. Speaking of the Ardbeg fermentation, bloody hell, Ardbeg. I do think that there are common notes between this and fermentation. I think that extreme fruitiness, and on the Ardbeg fermentation there's a little bit of a creamy cheesiness, which I think is a common note between these two, at least to some extent. I think that the results of the long fermentation on this one are possibly a little bit less interesting, because on the Ardbeg you had the peat, and that peat went through that ringer of the long fermentation time as well, and that did some really interesting things. But with this one, because you haven't got that peat, you're really exposing that estery fruitiness even more. But most of all, I think this is an incredibly well-made 10-year-old whisky. As I said before, I absolutely think it's worth £70, whereas I probably wouldn't say that fermentation was worth £150, except for the curiosity factor. Comparing this Loch Lomond 3-week fermentation to the rest of the Loch Lomond range, I kind of touched on this before. I think it's difficult to compare it to the 10-year-old because it's such a low strength dram. It's really a much more commercial presentation at 40%. But I think that with all of them, this is absolutely, without a doubt, much fruitier. There is very clear signs that longer fermentation period has had an effect, and it's definitely a positive effect. I think that you've lost certain things. I said before that there's a little bit less of that creamy butteriness in this, and possibly a little bit less of the cereally malty notes, probably less of those caramel and bourbon notes as well, which is probably a direct result of, I'm assuming, more refill casks going into this one. It is very clearly the same distillery though, just with the fruit turned up to 11. Actually really reminds me, and I'm really pleased to say this because it's something that quite a few of us are finding hard to find now and we miss it, really reminds me of the Isle of Arran 14-year-old. It's got those wonderful sweet and sharp, juicy, malty notes, really the proper fruit bomb with those lovely green apple and slightly tart apple peel notes. And I think that it's really quite an achievement that Loch Lomond, with this 10-year-old whisky, have made something reminiscent of a 14-year-old bourbon and sherry maturation, using just 10 years in refill bourbon casks. Obviously without an identical, and this would be wonderful, but without an identical control whisky from Loch Lomond, and that would be so good if we could directly compare the results of this longer fermentation. We can't be sure that the differences here are definitely from that longer fermentation, but in my humble opinion, I think that they undoubtedly are. And that leaves us with the point that where we are now in today's whisky world, where a lot of distilleries are, to be fair to them, pushing for a higher quality presentation because it's getting a little bit more crowded in the whisky world and a little bit more competitive. I think that there are massive gains to be had from heading for a lower yield production, in particular these longer fermentation times, and it's really not hard. Every distillery is already capable with their existing equipment of starting to do this right now, but most of them won't because it impacts short-term profits. So yeah, it is 2 thumbs up from me to Loch Lomond. I really like this. It was really worthwhile doing, and I'd really like to see more of this. The interesting thing, in my opinion, is to see if any other distilleries are going to take up the challenge and give us something similar. I really, really hope that they do. So, if any of you have stayed with me until the end on this one, thank you. I imagine this has been quite a long one. Let me know what your thoughts are on this one and longer fermentations. If you think that there is a difference, a detectable difference between the style of whiskies that we're getting now from a slightly more rushed production and shorter fermentation times and shorter times in the washback, if you think that that is becoming apparent, and do you think that it's something that's worth pursuing? Thanks for watching, and cheers.